Good morning. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the election of 1900. This is an important election, and I will stress this throughout the lecture, because it is the decisive election where the U.S. moved from an isolationist country to imperialists. Okay, so these election maps, which are the next couple of slides here, they point out the following things. Both elections consisted of the same candidates. The first election, which was over free coinage of silver, was the main concern for the U.S. Remember the populists? 4 years later, we have the same candidates, but completely different issues to grapple with. On a piece of paper, I want you to answer this question. What was one of the major issues one of the candidates took that defined the election of 1900? I want you to take a couple seconds, and I want you to answer that question. Okay, if you said imperialism, give yourself a pat on the back. Okay, question of imperialism. In March of 1898, 2 years into William McKinley's first term as president, he gave Spain, which was in the midst of a brutal campaign of repression in Cuba, an ultimatum. Again, folks, this is nothing new, okay? Spain agreed to most of McKinley's demands, including the cessation of hostilities against Cubans, but balked at giving up its last major New World colony. On April 25th, Congress passed a formal declaration of war in the interest of securing Cuban independence. In the brief Spanish-American War, which John Hay dubbed, quote, the splendid little war, the United States easily defeated Spanish forces in the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. The subsequent Treaty of Paris, signed in December of 1898 and ratified by the Senate in February of 1899, ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States, and Cuba became independent. The conflict proved to be the defining issue of the election. McKinley, who was renominated by the Republicans at their National Convention in Philadelphia in June of 1900, continued to emphasize an expansionist foreign policy, arguing that the anti-American rebellion occurring in the Philippines had to be quelled and that American dominion there had to be, quote, supreme. He employed typical empire-building logic in justifying continued military intervention in the Philippines, claiming that the United States had a moral and religious obligation to, quote, civilize and Christianize its residents. His position was enhanced by the selection of his running mate, then New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt, who won all but one vote on the first ballot. McKinley's previous vice president, Garrett Hobart, died in office the previous year. So, Roosevelt had made his name during the war, the Spanish-American War, by leading a charge of Rough Riders that took Kettle Hill, frequently referred to as San Juan Hill, which was nearby in Cuba. He had returned home a national hero. His rise to the nomination was assisted by New York's political bosses, who were unhappy with his gubernatorial reform efforts, particularly in regard to patronage. Okay, again, we're going back to the Gilded Age here, guys. You know, you remember political bosses, patronage, the idea of political corruption, okay? Anyway, he sought to rid themselves of his meddlesome influence. William Jennings Bryan, McKinley's Democratic opponent in 1896, was again nominated as at the party's convention in July in Kansas City, Missouri. The Democrats vehemently decried the Republican pursuit of empire and resurrected the contentious issue of freely coining silver at a 16-to-1 ratio to gold. So the campaign and the election, so in Ohio, an industrialist named Mark Hanna, who had run McKinley's campaign and filled his coffers during his first presidential bid in 1896, and whom McKinley had appointed to a vacant Senate seat in 1897, again stumped for the incumbent. Also actively campaigning was Roosevelt, who proved himself to be a powerful orator and formidable debater as he traveled throughout the country. The two men were the primary faces of the Republican ticket. McKinley absented himself from campaigning. In addition to defending and exhorting the policy of expansionism, the Republicans called for the maintenance of the Dingley Tariff, instituted under McKinley in 1897. It was the highest protective tariff instituted in the United States up to that point. They cited the relative prosperity of the previous 4 years, using the campaign slogan, quote, 4 more years of the full dinner pail. In a reversal of their previous position, the Republicans, though still in favor of a canal through the Central American, down near Panama, pointedly declined to specify that it should cut through Nicaragua. They instead favored a Panamanian route, a position influenced by large donations from the new Panama Canal Company. The Democrats were left with little choice but to continue in favor of the Nicaraguan route. The platform also included a relatively tepid condemnation of efforts by Southern states to stonewall the enfranchisement of black voters established by the 15th Amendment. Though Bryan campaigned feverishly, delivering over 600 speeches and visiting over half of the 45 states, he floundered in his efforts to combat imperialist sentiment. His calls for the independence of the Philippines were unpopular. Many saw the country as being in a position of moral custodianship of the newly acquired territories. And when Bryan shifted to the issue of trusts, Republicans, also officially antitrust, merely flipped the issue back to him, citing Democrat Cleveland's poor record on the issue. In the end, McKinley prevailed, taking 51.7% of the popular vote and capturing 292 votes in the Electoral College. Bryan captured 45.5% of the popular vote and garnered only 155 electoral votes. Candidates from smaller parties, including the Socialist and the Prohibition Party, had little effort on the race. So, after this particular lecture, you are going to watch a rather long movie or video documentary on what comes next. So, basically, McKinley is nominated and wins the election in 1900, and then he is assassinated. So, watch the movie. Let's assassinate a president. And by the way, I hope you were given the opportunity for a extra credit. So hopefully you can see some parallels between the extra credit question and the next part of this lesson. All right, see ya.